Imagine living in a world where falling in love could be treated as a crime. Not because you had stolen anything. Not because you had betrayed your country. But because the person beside you belonged to the wrong family, the wrong social class, the wrong religion, or simply because someone more powerful had decided that your relationship was forbidden. For much of human history, marriage was not primarily about romance. It could determine property, political alliances, inheritance, religious legitimacy, and the survival of entire dynasties. And when those boundaries were crossed, punishment could be devastating. In some societies, couples were separated. In others, their families were disgraced, their property confiscated, or their marriages declared invalid. And in the harshest cases, forbidden relationships could lead to imprisonment, exile, corporal punishment, or death. But there is an important complication. Many of the stories repeated about forbidden lovers come from legends, later chronicles, or literary works, not reliable eyewitness accounts. Some famous tales may contain historical characters but have been transformed by centuries of storytelling. So behind the romance is something much darker, a struggle over who had the right to decide whom another human being could love. And sometimes, the punishment was not really about love at all. It was about power. But what really happened? To understand why relationships could become crimes, we have to abandon the modern assumption that marriage was primarily a private decision. In many ancient societies, marriage connected households. It could transfer land, secure alliances, produce legitimate heirs, strengthen political relationships, protect wealth. That meant choosing a spouse could affect far more people than the couple themselves. In ancient Rome, for example, social status mattered enormously. Roman law developed distinctions between legitimate marriage and relationships that did not have the same legal recognition. Marriage between people of certain social categories could be restricted, and Roman emperors occasionally legislated morality and sexual behavior. One of the most famous examples came under Emperor Augustus. His reforms attempted to encourage marriage among the upper classes and punish certain forms of sexual behavior considered harmful to Roman society. Adultery was transformed into a public legal offense rather than merely a private matter. And this created an extraordinary situation. A relationship that might have once been handled within a household could become a matter for the state. But Rome was not unique. Across history, rulers discovered that controlling marriage meant controlling inheritance. And inheritance meant controlling the future. That is why forbidden relationships so often appear at moments of political tension. A prince marrying the wrong person could alter a succession. A noblewoman marrying beneath her rank could move property outside an aristocratic family. A member of a ruling dynasty marrying a foreigner could create a diplomatic crisis. And sometimes, the person accused of immorality was simply standing between powerful people and what they wanted. That distinction becomes crucial when we enter medieval Europe. Medieval Europe produced some of history's most famous stories of forbidden romance. But the reality was usually more complicated than the legends. Take the story of Peter Abelard and Heloise in 12th century France. Abelard was one of Europe's most famous intellectuals. Heloise was an exceptionally educated young woman connected to a powerful clerical family. They entered into a secret relationship. When Heloise became pregnant, the situation became politically and socially dangerous. The couple secretly married, but the marriage did not solve the conflict. Heloise's uncle, Fulbert, believed Abelard had dishonored the family and attempted to force a response. What happened next became one of the most notorious episodes associated with medieval punishment. Abelard was attacked and sexually mutilated by men hired by Fulbert. The punishment was not simply personal revenge. It reflected a world in which family honor, sexual reputation, clerical status, and social hierarchy were deeply interconnected. Abelard survived, but his life changed permanently. He entered religious life, and Heloise eventually became an abbess. Centuries later, their correspondence became famous as one of history's great records of intellectual and emotional attachment. But there is an important warning. The surviving letters and accounts have complicated histories, and historians continue to debate questions about their authenticity, transmission, and interpretation. The story is real enough to reveal something important about medieval society. But it should not be treated as though every detail has been independently verified. And Abelard and Heloise were not the only couple caught between personal desire and social rules. Sometimes the punishment came directly from the law. Sometimes it came from the family. And sometimes the most terrifying punishment came from the state itself. In medieval and early modern Europe, sexual relationships could be regulated through both secular and religious law. Adultery, fornication, incest, and relationships prohibited by religious rules could carry serious consequences. But punishment varied enormously. In some jurisdictions, offenders faced fines or public humiliation. Others imposed imprisonment, corporal punishment, exile, or execution. And crucially, enforcement was rarely equal. A wealthy person might have access to legal defenses, powerful relatives, or political protection. A poor person often had none of these. This inequality becomes especially visible when we look at royal courts. Because for monarchs, marriage was rarely just marriage. It was diplomacy. Consider Henry VIII of England. His marital history is often presented as a story of personal obsession, but it was also fundamentally political. His desire to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon became entangled with succession, religion, international diplomacy, and the authority of the papacy. The result was enormous. England eventually broke with papal authority and established a new religious settlement under the crown. A marital dispute helped contribute to one of the most consequential political and religious transformations in English history. But ordinary people who crossed social or religious boundaries could face much smaller and sometimes harsher consequences. In parts of Europe, authorities used public punishment to make examples of couples. The message was clear. The community was watching. And the purpose of punishment was not merely to punish two people. It was to frighten everyone else. Nowhere was the danger of forbidden relationships more obvious than inside royal families. Royal blood was political currency. A marriage could create an alliance between kingdoms. A child could inherit territory. A queen's family could gain influence at court. That made relationships involving royalty extraordinarily dangerous. One of the most famous examples is the story of Edward II of England and Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was a close favorite of the king, and medieval chroniclers portrayed their relationship as unusually intimate. Modern historians continue to debate the exact nature of their sexual relationship. That uncertainty matters. It is tempting to look backward and place modern categories onto medieval people. But the evidence does not allow us to confidently reconstruct every aspect of their private lives. What we do know is that Gaveston's influence over Edward became deeply controversial among powerful nobles. He was exiled more than once. Eventually, political opposition turned violent. In 1312, Gaveston was captured by a group of nobles and executed. His death demonstrates something important about forbidden relationships in royal history. Sometimes the central issue was not whether a relationship was sexually forbidden. It was whether that relationship created an unacceptable concentration of power. The bedroom could become a battlefield for politics. And when politics failed, violence followed. But the most extreme consequences often appeared when relationships crossed religious boundaries. For centuries, religious identity was closely connected to political identity. In medieval Europe, Christian authorities placed restrictions on marriage between Christians and non-Christians, with rules varying by period and jurisdiction. Elsewhere, Islamic societies developed their own legal traditions concerning marriage between Muslims and non-Muslims. Jewish communities likewise operated under their own religious laws and communal structures. These systems were not identical, and they changed over time. But one principle repeatedly appears. Marriage was seen as a mechanism for preserving community identity. That could turn an intimate relationship into a public threat. The consequences could include social exclusion, legal complications, forced separation, or pressure from families and religious authorities. And then there was the issue of conversion. A relationship could become dramatically more dangerous when one person changed religion. Suddenly, the couple was no longer simply crossing a social boundary. They were crossing a boundary that governments and religious institutions could interpret as a threat to the community itself. But history contains an even more disturbing pattern. Sometimes authorities punished relationships not because the relationship itself was considered dangerous, but because it challenged an entire social hierarchy. Imagine being born into a family where your surname determines who you are allowed to marry. In aristocratic societies, marriage could be treated as a transaction involving estates, titles, and bloodlines. A noble marrying a commoner could be seen as damaging family prestige. A wealthy heiress could become the center of a struggle between relatives trying to control her inheritance. And royal families took these concerns even further. The British monarchy provides a particularly revealing example. For centuries, royal marriages were constrained by political and legal expectations. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772, for instance, gave the British monarch significant power over the marriages of certain members of the royal family. The law was designed partly to prevent marriages considered unsuitable for members of the dynasty. But the consequences of such rules were not always imprisonment or execution. Sometimes the punishment was exclusion. A person could lose status, financial support, political influence, or access to the royal court. In some cases, the relationship survived, but at enormous personal cost. This reminds us that punishment does not always look like a prison cell. Sometimes it looks like being cut off from the world that gave you your identity. But history became even darker and stranger when forbidden relationships entered legend. Perhaps the most famous is the story of Romeo and Juliet. Two young lovers. Two rival families. A secret marriage. Death. The story feels so historically authentic that it is easy to forget something fundamental. Romeo and Juliet were fictional characters. Shakespeare's play was based on earlier literary traditions, particularly versions of an Italian story that had already circulated before Shakespeare wrote his drama. There is no evidence that Romeo and Juliet existed as the historical couple described in the play. Yet the story survives because it expresses something that genuinely existed. Families could oppose marriages. Social divisions could destroy relationships. And young people could have far less control over marriage than many people today assume. The fictional story became a mirror of a real social problem. Then there is the story of Tristan and Isolde, another famous medieval romance involving love, loyalty, political obligation, and betrayal. Again, it belongs primarily to the realm of medieval literature and legend. These stories are valuable, but not because they prove that particular couples were punished exactly as the legends describe. They reveal what societies feared. And what they feared most was often not love itself. It was love escaping control. The burden was also profoundly unequal. Women were often judged according to standards that did not apply equally to men. A woman's sexual reputation could affect not only her own life but the perceived legitimacy of her children, the honor of her family, and the inheritance of property. In many societies, accusations of sexual misconduct could therefore become weapons. And historians must be careful here. Legal texts tell us what authorities wanted to prohibit. They do not necessarily tell us what ordinary people actually did. Court records tell us what was prosecuted. They do not reveal every relationship that escaped detection. This is one of the great limitations of studying forbidden relationships. The historical record is biased toward people who were caught. Millions of private relationships left no written record at all. That means the couples we remember may be the exceptions, not the typical cases. And then something unexpected happened. Punishment did not always preserve the social order. Sometimes it exposed its weaknesses. When governments attempted to control marriage too aggressively, people found ways around the rules. They eloped. They married secretly. They forged documents. They crossed borders. They changed religious affiliations. They appealed to courts. And sometimes entire communities gradually changed their attitudes. Over centuries, ideas about marriage shifted. Economic independence increased. Religious authority weakened in some societies. States increasingly separated civil marriage from religious control. Romantic love became more culturally important. The idea that marriage should be based on personal choice gradually gained strength. The transformation was not sudden. And it certainly did not happen everywhere at the same time. But the direction was unmistakable. The private lives of individuals slowly became less subject to the direct control of families, churches, aristocracies, and monarchies. Yet the old instincts never completely disappeared. Even today, families, governments, religions, and communities can still place enormous pressure on relationships. The methods may have changed. The struggle over control has not. For most of history, falling in love was never simply a private act. It could connect families, destroy alliances, change inheritances, challenge religious boundaries, threaten political power, and in extreme cases, bring punishment severe enough to end a person's life. But perhaps the darkest lesson is not that ancient and medieval societies were cruel. It is that human beings have repeatedly been willing to use institutions, laws, and violence to control something as personal as whom another person could love. And the historical record forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. When we read about forbidden lovers today, are we really reading stories about romance? Or are we reading stories about power? Because behind every law, every family feud, every royal scandal, and every punishment was the same fundamental struggle. Who gets to decide the boundaries of another person's life? Some couples were forgotten. Some became legends. Some became symbols of resistance. And some left behind only a few lines in a court record, evidence that, centuries ago, two people crossed a boundary someone else had decided they were never allowed to cross. History remembers the punishments. But perhaps we should remember the question that came before them. Why was their love considered more dangerous than the power that tried to destroy it? What do you think, were these punishments mainly about morality, or were they really about controlling wealth, status, religion, and power? Because sometimes the darkest chapters of history begin with a simple human choice. Who do you love? And who has the right to stop you?